Okay, well, Callum touched on a topic yesterday, and I thought I'd do a little bit of a different take on it. The topic of immigration and mass remigration, repatriation, deportations. I mean, let's cut to the quick, shall we, gentlemen? Our country is full of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of, at best, fifth columnists, if not outright enemies of the people and the state.
Got no disagreements from me so far.
Um, a diabolical state of affairs. And recently, the Overton window seems to have moved a tad on that. Douglas Murray appeared on Trigonometry, didn't really mince his words. I know some people, certainly in the so-called distant right, have got a few questions about his timing, perhaps some of his paymasters. But nonetheless, I'm happy to see it. I don't care about that necessarily. I'm happy to see it. Anything that moves the Overton window. I wrote an article back in June last year where I said about that mass remigration should be inevitable. The point of the article there is saying that we should really, one tactic is just to talk as though it is inevitable. That's one of the things Tony Blair is not the first person to have done it. It's a tried and tested tactic. Just talk as though something is in fact inevitable. It's quite a powerful gambit to use.
He spoke about globalization at Labour Party conference as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. And I think that's very useful framing. It's also very useful framing to look at the way that Douglas has been talking about this, which I think is far more helpful than some of the people on the dissident right that are jumping in front of the bullet shot at multiculturalism and its excesses, saying, but it's just about Israel, no. And it's like, okay, right, no. Douglas Murray is not mincing his words, and he's using a moral depth charge at this, which is very useful when he says, I do not want to share my country with Hamas supporters. They should leave. If you are offended by the missing posters of Jewish children, you should leave. And that is not tribal. That is conditional on whether or not you support the ethos of Britain. That is conditional on whether or not you support our terrorist enemies. And so that is saying, okay, if you are not willing to participate in our civilization and you are declaring your intent to form a Muslim army to annex it to a caliphate, not only should you not be allowed to stage a protest in favor of that, you should not be here because you constitute a threat to our way of life. You don't get to come to a country and fundamentally want to change it. And that's very powerful framing. And I think that's why it's become a very sensible thing to say. Actually, no, we shouldn't have to have house guests that want to trash our furniture and track mud in our rug. I think that's a very sensible thing to do.
To be a bit of a steelman for some members of the DR, I would imagine, and I can't speak for them because I can't read their minds, but I would imagine that the animus is coming from the fact that with the change in rhetoric coming almost entirely on the basis of we need to save Israel, we need to protect Israel, we need to protect those who are aligned with Israel, given that that is the condition that this rhetoric has arrived on, the worry would most probably be that if the only time we can ever have control over our borders is for the safety of Israel, then the second all of a sudden something not in our interest but in Israel's interest comes along, that the winds would change again and go straight back to screwing us over for the sake of a foreign nation in the middle of in the thousands of miles.
Okay, here's why I think they're wrong about that. Please, your segment, so feel free to correct me. Two reasons. One, you can disaggregate Israel and British Jews. That's fine. Yes, at the protest, they're waving Israeli flags, of course, because it's in response to the massacre on October the 7th. But when they're also being shouted at because they're singing God Save the King, there is clear animus against the English at whose behest these people are here being displayed. And we know that because of the Cenotaph protest. The Cenotaph has absolutely nothing to do with Israel, but they have stated their intent to disrespect the ceremony anyway. And so I tweeted this.
That's just a result of, as Bo has stated at the beginning, importing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of fifth columnists who, unlike us, like people of our generation, who weren't properly taught history and weren't taught about the historical conflicts that this country has been involved in, except for World War II and possibly the Great War as well, for Remembrance Day, of course. They get they know their history, they know their historic conflicts, and they know that they're coming over to a place that they have had historic conflict with, and that they can still see us recognizably as their own enemies. They're leeching off of our welfare state for the sake of their own, material convenience. But they still don't like us. They don't see us as anything resembling a friend in the mass. Obviously, you'll get exceptions here and there of individuals who genuinely want to assimilate. Most of them don't.
Well, one thing I'd say is that I didn't want to really dwell too long on Douglas Murray, particularly, other than that it's just an example of getting the Overton window moved. I would, in fact, go further than him. It's not just Hamas supporters or apologists or Islamists. There's all sorts of people with all sorts of thinking in this country that really shouldn't be here, should be repatriated back to the countries of their forefathers. All sorts of people. For example, I mean, anyone that's any foreign national that commits any crime
I think that's a
should
very
be,
sensible
should
take
be
there.
deported.
That's just a reasonable standard.
Right, yeah.
Again, why should we have house guests that dress for furniture?
Anyone with any criminal record in their home country should never be allowed to set foot on these islands. It used to be the case, I remember being told back in the 60s, it would have been, that John Lennon himself, one of the most famous men in the world, had extraordinary trouble even being allowed to visit the US because he had a criminal record. I think he did some, I'm not sure what criminal record he had, but it was a very minor thing.
Lots of those rock and pop stars in the 60s got put in prison.
But he had real trouble. And anyway, that's not a bad standard. I mean, my line would be that, well, we essentially have a type of open borders, don't we? So all those people that turn up in small boats without correct documentation, or even if they've got a passport, you don't come across illegally on a small boat like that. All of those people repatriated back to where they come from. Now, it is a little bit difficult, legally speaking, because we're in a bind. We've allowed ourselves legally to get into a bit of a bind. Of course, there's the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which quite often gets brought up. Word on the inside is that Rishi's got no intention of repealing that, or you don't even repeal it, you just leave it.
Well, the Tory
Apparently he's
Party,
got no intention.
the Tory Party are very split, even among the New Conservatives group, who are pushing for lower legal immigration and the complete elimination of illegal immigration. Folks like Danny Kruger actually just want to tear it up because of its contradictions. There are others in there that think, oh, we can just reform it, and I think that's painfully naive.
Right, yeah.
Well, the inner party of the Tories are too focused on building a Holocaust memorial right next to Parliament right now to worry
because,
about,
of course, that was
affecting
awful.
Borders.
Yeah, the rot goes very, very deep, though. That reform, Richard Tice, I know he's not everyone's cup of tea, but he has at least said openly and explicitly, the Home Office is not fit for purpose. Border force, even the CPS, seem to be unfit for purpose. It would require probably a whole new government department staffed by, quote unquote, true believers who are prepared to actually get people deported. There's a few examples, aren't there, when we've tried to deport people here or there, and citizens get involved. There was that woman on a plane. Remember that? There was, I think, was he a Jamaican rapist? I can't remember, being deported, and she kicked up a stink and got the plane grounded.
Oh, this was the thing that Diane Abbott supported happening as well.
One example. There was another example in Scotland. Do you remember
I was
that,
thinking of Scotland when they were trying to take the migrants out of the house and the entire street rallied around them.
Some sort of quite bizarre flash mob suddenly appeared
At Eid. Even though, by the way, those illegal criminals were Sikhs.
Right, yeah.
So how could you do this at Eid? Nicola Sturgeon says to a bunch of Sikhs.
I think that is a crime that should be severely punished. Severely punished for doing that.
Well, you could classify it as traitorous behaviour.
Or obstruction of justice.
Yeah.
That's just.
I mean, that's not enough for me, because I think the punishment is usually quite small for that. I think it should be quite a long custodial sentence to deter people from ever really dreaming of doing that. There's the idea of chain migration. That should stop. I think all new citizenships should be entirely halted, at least for a while. Just in a blanket way, at least for a while. Student visas. So a few of the lesser polytechnics lose a whole bunch of money because they can't charge foreign people lots of money to study at their university.
How will Oxford survive without all of those Chinese students?
All sorts of things. It needs a root and branch reform, in my opinion. I mean, most people agree with that. There was a poll recently. It was mentioned in the trigonometry episode. Sort of 90% of Conservative and 70-odd% of Labour voters just agree that the whole system is entirely broken. When Border Force and the police and well, just the Home Office when you look at some of the senior civil servants at the Home Office, it's just obvious that they're not working in the public interest, in the interest of the public weal, WEAL. And that's the first charge of any government, isn't it? Surely, to be working in the interests of the nation and the people. They're simply not doing that. It's a first-class dereliction of duty.
Well, we know from Sage they were lifelong members of the Communist Party setting pandemic policy, as if there weren't ulterior motives at work there.
From what you're talking about, the European Convention on Human Rights, I think another one that makes it difficult to remigrate, specifically the people that come over on the small boats. And people in the comments can correct me if I get a few of the details wrong. But I think one of the other major ones, ironically enough, is I think it's the Modern Slavery Act that they have, because it means that I think that you get automatic refugee status and legal protections if you can be classified as having been human trafficked. And of course, the people who are bringing them over on the small boats oftentimes are human traffickers outside of just this being their business. And you can always claim when you get onto the shores that, oh, I was human trafficked over here, which immediately puts legal barriers in place of being able to deport them.
The other one as well is what Rishi Sunak said he was going to turn around and join if they did leave the ECHR, which is the 1951-52 UN Refugee Convention. And the definition of a refugee encoded in there is anyone unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin. It's kind of like AOC's definition in the Green New Deal of why you should receive universal basic income. Anyone unable or unwilling to go to work. Yeah, we should just pay you if you just don't want to be where you were born.
I just feel like having a lie-in this morning.
Yeah.
Give me money.
It seems very clear at this point that the very concept of human rights has been weaponized against us. There's no way to really avoid that conclusion, at least in my mind. It's more than, again, I say the rot goes deeper than that as well. For example, it was in the news a while ago, just one tiny example. Have you ever heard of Dr. Halima Begum?
Yes, I have.
She's alternately the first secretary for the Department of International Development and the CEO of Runnymede Trust.
Yeah.
Involved in all sorts of things. So a revolving door with these types of people. And that's just one tiny example. There seems to be lots and lots, a surprising number of organisations whose entire raison d'etre, entire reason for being, is to shift the Overton window in their favour, keep it there, and demonise anyone that is against that.
This is what Doug Stokes coined the grievance industrial complex.
Right. And there's all sorts of organisations. I've made a small list here just to give some people an idea. So many of these names people out there may have heard of. A lot of them you probably wouldn't have heard of. And they do across the whole spectrum, from just trying to demonise people to actively doing things through the courts and all sorts of stuff. And it's the idea of human rights being weaponised against us. There's organisations like Hope Not Hate, the Runnymede Trust, the Institute for Race Relations, Unite Against Fascism, Stand Up to Racism, Institute for Strategic Dialogue, the Tony Blair Institute, Human Rights Watch, Centre for Countering Digital Hate, the Defamation League, Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right, Searchlight, Stand Up to Racism, the Refugee Council, Civil Rights Defenders, Human Rights Without Frontiers, European Centre for Minority Issues, Human Rights Foundation, Frontline Defenders, Human Rights House Foundation, the Open Society, all sorts of things under that, the British Future, Freedom House, Human Rights Watch, International Service for Human Rights, International Society for Human Rights, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, Centre for Economic and Social Rights, Minority Rights Group International, the Advocates for Human Rights. It goes on and on and on. Humanity in Action, Protection International, Amnesty International, Care for Calais. It goes on and on and on. There's a surprising number of these things. A whole industry, if you like, dedicated, designed to make sure that we can never deport criminals in our midst.
You can also throw the Socialist Workers' Party in there. They're always available whenever there is a spontaneous protest with all sorts of outfits and signs and slogans ready-made.
Stand Up to Racism as well. But the Socialist Workers' Party is a bit of an outlier because I just think they're honest. The rest of them, and this is the right. This is the semantic shift.
I think there's such a thing as
hold on 1 second. The semantic shift that is engaged in here is what makes normal people who want to be seen as non-racist cave and act in a cowardly manner that is complicit with the destruction of the country. Because most of those names are non-objectionable names to uninitiated ears. And so this is the level of subversion. As you said, they've weaponized the concept of human rights because particularly the post-war doctrine, this is why a Holocaust memorial is being knocked up in the country that fought against the country that perpetrated it. The whole concept of human rights is being weaponized against the consciences of the people that they are seeking to destroy the country of. So in any other country, this wouldn't fly. These organizations don't exist. But it's just because our nation is compassionate and cares about those things that those non-objectionable names can be used for organizations that want to destroy the place.
You're right. It's very deliberately subversive, the names they choose. It's like weaponizing the concept of social justice. On the face of it, if you're not politically aware, you could be forgiven for thinking, what's wrong with social justice? What's wrong with human rights? Who in their right mind would be against human rights? Well, obviously the whole thing's been subverted and weaponized. One of the things I'll just quickly say is that I'm happy to take Douglas Murray's help here, despite some objections, because we need, I think, in my mind, it's my view, we need any help we can get. There's a vast array of enemies aligned against us here. And if there's a mainstream voice, for whatever reason, almost, I'll take it. And so that's mainly what I want to say. I think that's nearly my time up here. But
well, I wanted to say, having briefly spoken to Douglas, I can assure you that he's a friend and a fellow traveller on this issue. So,
sure.
To add my own point on the human rights issues, so with a lot of these organizations, a lot of the time you'll find that they are explicitly globalist and internationalist, and oftentimes not staffed or headed by people who are native to the countries that they're exerting influence over. For instance, not Searchlight, although I believe Searchlight is also, was that Nick Lowell's along with Hope Not Hate, as he's run both of those or set up both of those, I think. For instance, British Future is run by, I think, a half Indian, half English man. And of course, as with all mixed race people who are leftist activists, you find that there is basically no association or no pride in the British side of the heritage. It's all to do with the Indian. Position yourself entirely as an outsider of the culture who needs to change the culture. And the human rights, the UN Convention of Human Rights that came about in the post-World War II period, I would say was the first example of when they really start to weaponize the concept of human rights against national sovereignty. Because really, what was that? It was a bunch of, let's be perfectly honest, leftist activists within the UN deciding arbitrarily what constitutes a human right and what doesn't in an internationalist sense. So you as a nation can no longer maintain your own sovereignty. You have to submit to this. And also it just happens that this means that you're unable to do things like properly protect your own borders. There's still a period where you were able to do so, but really with just reaching the inertia of the logic that set off. It was a chain. It was a domino effect where it just tumbles down, and now we're living in the result of the enshrining of those
that's a really
types of human rights.
Important point as well, because something Callum's covered a few times before is when the UN formulated its definition of human rights, they actually caved to the Soviet delegation who said, well, we don't want total free speech because we want the ability to suppress Nazis, which actually meant just smack down their political opposition for anyone who is an anti-communist and intern them in a camp. So the UN is more than happy to cave to terrorist dictatorial regimes when it suits them, and then weaponize the own good consciences of countries like Britain and many members of America against them to just flood them with foreign criminals.
It's interesting you mentioned the Socialist Workers' Party. I think at least one or two of those I listed were born out of them. But we've had the age of mass migration, had the attempt at multiculturalism and globalization, and if their goal was public interest, which it obviously isn't, if it were, it's been terrible. If their goal was, in fact, always to sort of destroy the very fabric of our society, then it's been spectacularly successful. I think we need now to move into the age of remigration. And I would suggest to anyone out there, just start, if you're on our side, so to speak, just start speaking as though it's an inevitability. That is quite a powerful tool, I think. That it has to happen. It will happen, and it sort of becomes a self-perpetuating prophecy. Hopefully,
Well,
not really got much to lose by doing that.
If you'd rather Britain looked like elsewhere, I'm more than happy to help you live elsewhere. Because I haven't got anywhere else to go. I've just got Britain, and I'd like Britain to stay the way it is. Actually,
Well, you've got Ireland.
I would like to see a whole new government department, staffed by people that want to see things reversed, in charge of repatriation, remigration, and making sure our borders actually function. Because without borders, you don't really have a country. The very rule of law itself is undermined to the point of becoming absurd. So we're in a difficult situation. It really is. But never give up hope. Anything could happen.
If you appreciated that episode from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as this video between Carl and Shad on a discussion about dadism. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Twitter at lotuseaters_com on Twitter. Thank you and goodbye.